welcome. Bruce Maxwell is not here today, so he asked me to introduce our speaker for today, which I'm very happy to do. Anton Bekkerman is an associate professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Economics here at MSU in Bozeman. He's also the associate director of the Montana Agricultural Experiment Station. He came in 2009 to MSU after getting his PhD in economics at North Carolina State University. His research focuses on grain marketing and transportation issues, ag policy, dryland production and management. And a quick review of his publications just from the last year includes research on crop insurance, economic returns from conversion of pasture, invasive agricultural pests, the impact of climate change on dryland farming, and the price premium associated with using corks in wine bottles. I'd be curious to hear the 30-second answer on that. But today, we're talking about the Agricultural Experiment Station, so I'll turn it over to Anton.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, so apparently if you control and you account for a whole bunch of characteristics in wine bottles, and you go to the store, like a grocery store, and you buy a bottle of wine with a cork versus a screw cap, you're paying about $1 premium for that wine bottle. So the lesson is buy wines that have screw caps. They're going to be the same quality, but cheaper. So there you go. Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me here and presenting. As Rich mentioned, I've been here about 10 years. Most of my research is focused on the marketing aspect of the agricultural economics industry, grain related, mostly cropping systems as well, with some interdisciplinary work. But I got this, I was appointed to this new position in the associate directors of maize in July of last year. So I haven't been here for very long, at least in that position. And so it's been a learning process. It still is. I think it's gonna keep being a learning process. I still have, it's a 0.5 FTE position and 0.5 with, the research, the teaching, and everything else. So it adds up to approximately 2.7. But so it's been a learning experience in balancing everything. But so what I want to do today is give you, I wasn't sure exactly the audience and who's going to be here and who wasn't. So I put together kind of a very general to some specific things, information about the Ag Experiment Station. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the structure, and I'll start off with giving a brief overview of what maize isn't, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions of what folks think the experiment station is, and where those things, let's see, exit. And why those misconceptions exist, and where they're why there are misconceptions, and then I'll talk about the structure of the experiment station, kind of what's going on with the experiment station, how's the research being informed, how it's being communicated, and then talk about kind of the things that are driving and making this whole operation work, and show you some interesting data. I'm an economist, so I have to show at least one graph about the underlying structure of the experiment station. And I included vision, forward, I don't know. I'll include some things that I think are interesting to think about, and hopefully it can start at least a conversation, because I think there's no single vision. So I want to start off with what maize isn't. I get this a lot, or I've heard this a lot from lots of people within the university, outside of the university, that the Ag Experiment Station is the statewide network of research centers, and it's like the physical structures, right? So all it is just these 7 research centers around the state, and it's the applied and experiments, applied work and experiments that go on there, and that's it, right? So it's this physical structure. So I think part of it is when you hear the station, you think of it as being a physical structure, and it really isn't. It's more than, it's an idea. It's more than just this physical structure of centers around. So this is, I want to apologize for the slide. At least one slide in any presentation has to be packed with a lot of text and really kind of messy. But I promise this is the last one here that has this much stuff on it. But I think it was important to put some words to what maze is and what the experiment station is. And really, it's like I said, it's more than just this physical structure of these research centers. It's this concept, it's an idea of a federal-state partnership for developing this agricultural and natural resource research, as well as communicating that research out. So it's this entity, this idea that gets this research developed and this research communicated. And I'll give you a little bit of the background, kind of go into the main missions. And these are directly from what the defined maze missions are as they're listed. But a little bit of background, a little bit of history. You guys have heard, I'm sure, of the Hatch Act of 1887. This is what established these experiment stations in each state, and they're typically connected to land-grant colleges, universities. At that point, it was colleges. And the idea is providing money and this base source of money that is going to go to develop ag and natural resource research and communicating that research. And initially, it was focused primarily on developing research related to plant growth and soil minerals. And obviously, it's evolved as more knowledge is developed and more ideas and challenges have been brought up. But that was the initial idea. And the initial sort of goal was to provide this annual source of funding. And I think that's a really important aspect. And I'll talk a little bit about it later on and why this base funding and public source of funding is important. But it also allowed this creation of a formal system, a formal network of development and communication of this research, as well as the development and training of scientists. So it's not only the creation of science, but also the development of scientists to go into the future. So and I think this this idea of having this research and outreach be done across an expansive and a highly diverse landscape. It goes both to this the idea that, well, if we just look at Montana, there's lots of agro ecosystems, lots of different communities, lots of different ideas. But I think it also I think points to the fact that we have a lot of scientists here who have their own ideas, and a lot of them are really, really good. And so how do we encompass all of this in such a way that this research gets done and gets to be impactful? And this Hatch Act that came between the Morrill Act, which established land-grant universities, and the Smith-Lever Act, which established extension, the idea was for it to be this bridge between the land-grant university, the education, and the extension, which is going out in education in the non-traditional classroom. The missions of maze, specifically for Montana, it very much goes with the initiative, this idea of the Hatch Act, that it's conducting basic and applied research, right? It's developing research that starts from an idea that needs, potentially having this initial idea being researched and developed in the lab, and then how does it transition from that basic research into application and ultimately adoption in the ag and natural resource industries. And this research that goes from basic to the applied, the goal of it is to capture value from the resources that we have in Montana and obviously in other states as well, and how to do that effectively and efficiently, right? As new challenges come about, as new opportunities come about, how do we continue to capture that value, but do so in a way that doesn't trash the environment, or doesn't reallocate resources in a way that is inequitable, for example. And that's the last part of how do we conduct this research and apply this research in a way that improves the quality of life. So that's certainly kind of the pillars of the Maze mission. And the last one is, right, this is the primary research and development agency for the farmers and ranchers across the state, whether it's here on campus or in the small campuses around the state and the research centers. I'll show you that in a little bit. That's the goal, is how to be that primary R&D agency. And as I'll show you some data later, I think this R&D agency has been really successful relative to other states, for example. So here's let's see if I can get this out of the way. Maybe not. Okay. So here's what I talked about Maze being this idea and the concept of having this integrated system of research being developed and communicated. And here's what the physical aspect of this idea looks like, right? So main campus is here, and this is where a lot of the basic research occurs. This is where a lot of the applied research occurs. This is where ideas get developed. This is where most of the faculty are. It's on the main campus. There are research farms, so all of these little markers around the main campus, they're intended to both be research and teaching farms, right? Again, going back to that concept of developing science and training scientists. So, Red Bluff and Port Farm and the Post Agronomy Farm, Boots and Fort Ellis. So this is sort of the headquarters, right, of Maze is Bozeman. And most of the faculty who have a Maze appointment, who are associated with the experiment station, who have been tasked with doing research that relates to ag and natural resource and answering questions that are related to those industries in Montana are here on campus, right? They're not necessarily at those research centers. So that's where where I get where I think that the misconception is really gets answered is, look, most of the faculty are not at these research centers. So you can't really look at Maze as being this collection of just the research centers. But of course, I'm sure you guys have heard this saying, Bozeman is in Montana, but it's not Montana, right? So I think that applies very, very well to Maze as well, and to the fact that there's a lot of ag, there's a lot of natural resources around the state, and there's a lot of diversity of the challenges and opportunities around the state. And so there needs to be some way to capture that diversity and to integrate that information into the research that's being done across the state. So these research centers, the western one is in Corvallis near Missoula, northwest is in Kalispell, the western triangle, WTARC, is in Conrad, the northern ag research center is in Havre, central is in Moccasin, Lewistown area, Huntley, Billings is the southern one, and then the eastern one is in Sidney, Montana. Right there, they're located across this diverse landscape of stakeholders, of communities, of challenges, and they are a way to both bring in ideas and bring in information about what's important right now, what's timely, what's relevant, what should we be looking at, as well as communicating research and testing the application of the research that may be done both at those research centers and at MSU. So this idea that we have both faculty and technical staff and professional staff. While the faculty, the split is the majority of them are on campus. The technical and professional staff those who support the development and the application and the testing. They're more of that staff at the research centers because that's more of the on-the-ground research that occurs. So, and I think the integration of those two things is really critical. It's really important, and I think it's important to the success of this whole thing, this whole grand idea. Got it. So the foundation of all of this research, it comes down to this Hatch project. And this is where the public funding, I think, becomes really important. So this Hatch project, all of you who are associated with Maze have written one. They're usually for 5 years, unless it's the first one. And it's a plan. It's a plan of research, right? And there's about 120 faculty members. There's about 120 Hatch projects. And it's each faculty member's idea of what their research is trying to do, what their research is trying to accomplish, what questions it's going to answer, and then how is it going to be communicated to the stakeholders, whether it's other faculty members, whether it's people, other researchers, producers, agribusinesses, whatever. And the fact that they're 5 years, but they're renewable, right? So really they're these career-long research plans that you can establish. And the money that comes for funding these projects, it's all public dollars, right? It's state and federal. And I'll show you a little bit later what the breakdown is across those two sources of public funding. And because there are these career-long plans and they're funded by public dollars, what this allows researchers to do is establish ideas and visions and research that is big risk, big reward, right? So there's no private industry, private firm that says, well, if you have an idea and it's starting from nothing, and maybe in 15, 20 years, it'll make a huge difference. There's no private company that's gonna go for that, unless it's huge, right? But most of the companies, most private firms are never gonna go for that, right? Because you need, fast returns on investment, and you need to satisfy stockholders. That's not the idea behind, at least in my mind, that's not the idea behind these Hatch projects. I think for many of these Hatch projects, they're bigger than just these 1 to 2 year to 3 year. Let's get something out and let's see how much money we can make on it. It's the idea that, look, there's going to be public funding, and if you come up with an idea 15 years ago and you've worked on it, and it turns out that 15 years later it flops and it's a complete disaster. That's okay, right? Because if it didn't flop, it could have made a huge difference, right? And there's no way that private funding is, in a perfect world, we would have private funding that would support these kind of ideas and these kind of projects, but really it comes from the public funding. And that's where the idea of public funding supporting these long-term goals and long-term visions and projects comes in. So obviously, as I said, there's 120 of these, and 120 great ideas that could turn out to be really, really good. They may not, but who knows? And in the meantime, from this grand idea, you're going to have little branches and training and other things that you can leverage this research and develop more of it, more research. And because there's so much diversity, I just wanted to show you a little bit of the fact that, look, yeah, there are 120 different ideas, but a lot of them are integrated within each other. And this is just a sample of the types of integrative projects and efforts that are supported in some way by the experiment station. Whether it's directly funding some of these facilities or operations, whether it's funding researchers who are associated with these centers or institutes or labs, or projects or efforts in some way maize is touching very diverse set of research concepts, right? So pollinator health, spatial, thermal, you guys, Institute of Ecosystem, this economic analysis center, right? WOLAB, only one of two in the country, really important for maintaining that aspect of research. The Scudder Diagnostic Lab for Plant Diseases, Serial Quality Lab. We'll talk about the importance and the impact of the research that goes on here relative to the types of products and the agricultural products that are produced here, and the quality of those products, and why that is really important for the impact of research that comes out of maize. Post crops, potato, right? Small industry, but really important. State seed lab. The research centers, obviously, the research farms, breeding and variety trial programs, huge in the state. Plant Growth Center with its greenhouses and incubators. The large animal labs where basic knowledge can be tested, and of course the environmental analytical lab. So again, I'm sure I have missed something, but I think this gives certainly a sampling of how maize plays a role in the research that goes on here. There's also a structure about how maize research is informed and how it informs, right? In terms of informing, I talked a little bit about this where, look, maize has an advisory committee, right? That is one of the more important ways that maize as this entity, as the ship, gets a sense of, are we doing things right? Are we going in the right direction? Are we trying to tackle the big challenge, the big picture ideas and opportunities in the right way? So this advisory committee, it's composed of about 10 or 11 people from around the state. They're usually producers or somehow associated with the agricultural industry. There's a representative from that lobbies on behalf of maize, the experiment station in Washington. And all these ideas are brought in. There's several annual meetings with this committee. There's phone calls, and that's the driver, right? Each department, I don't know if it's every department, but certainly several departments. I know the animal science department has their own advisory committee. And so that's where ideas are brought in into the research. There's certainly each research center around the state has an advisory committee of farmers and those associated with the agricultural industry, stakeholders in the community who bring information in and then take that information out, take the impacts out. And certainly you guys, right? Researchers, I guess not you guys, all of us, right? I still have that 0.5 FTE. So right, well, we go to meetings, but we think about the research. We have our hatch projects. It's the way that we generate ideas and the way that we inform, and obviously getting that information out. It's very similar, right? We go back to the advisory committees. We tell them what we're working on. We have these different seminars and outreach presentations that folks give. We work with Extension. There's field days, July 23rd, post farm is this year. So lots of ways that we have both formal and informal structures to communicate ideas in and out of this idea, this ship. So how does this work? How do the gears keep turning? So this is the more data-driven part of the talk. So there's two ways, right? I talked about this public funding, and this is through that federal-state partnership. And actually, the state part of the partnership is has only been around formally since 2002. So in 1887, this Hatch Act was passed, and it only said that the federal government would provide annual funding to these experiment stations. And it's only in 2002 that there was an amendment to that act that said, oh, well, the state has to kick in some money as well. And right now, it's a one-to-one required match. So for every dollar that the federal government kicks in, the state has to at least match it with $1. They can, of course, go more, and I'll show you some interesting data on that. But that's the requirement to get those federal And then that's the foundation. And then researchers leverage that to get external grants and contracts. Here's what some of those data look like in terms of where the money is coming into MACE and what's funding that foundation, right? That initial public funds that allow us all to do the research that we really want to do or we think is important or we think that 10, 15, 20 years from now is going to have a major impact on an industry or a community or stakeholders that we're trying to target. So remember I said that, so the blue bar, this is all in millions. The blue bar represents the state and the yellow portion represents the federal. So remember I said that we need to match 1-to-1. Well, Montana is matching about 4 times. Right, I was really pretty surprised when I saw this the first time, and was pretty flattered by how much the state thinks of the research that we do. But I think it's a really nice signal that's being sent from the state that says, look, we think the research that you do is really important. It's needed. It benefits the state, and continually we see the state kicking in quite a bit more money than they have to. Jamie. Yeah.
What is the typical state funding sources? You know, a couple.
The taxes.
Oh, or but like grant, like where faculty applying. Like is it DNR?
Right. Okay, got it. No, so this is, so every 2 years we have the legislative session, and the legislators come together and they say, okay, we're going to give the experiment station $13 million, right? So it's the taking of the tax revenue and allocating it to the experiment station. Obviously, you know, researchers can, and I'll talk about the leveraging, they can go on and they say if there are other grants or other programs, they can get additional state funds. So we have, you know, the wheat and barley committee gives about $1 million a year to doing wheat and barley research. The fertilizer assessment fund gives about $400,000 a year to doing research on fertilizer, the post grants, et cetera. But this is purely coming in from the revenue. So quite a bit of additional support than the state has to kick in. So how does that compare? I saw this talk in October at a conference I went to, and Greg Perry, can't really see it, but Greg Perry is an economist out of Colorado State, and he's been working on some of this experiment station funding research. And this is some of the data that he presented, and I just put it in a different form. But it gives an idea of how much each experiment station is funded from the state. And what I did was I said, okay, well, relative to, so on the horizontal axis is the level of, in millions of dollars, of how much each state's experiment station is being funded, okay, in terms of just the level of dollars. So about, Montana is right around that $13, $14 million. On the y-axis, it's the percentage of the total state budget that is being allocated to the experiment station, right? So every state is, you know, some states are bigger, some states are smaller. Montana doesn't have a lot of people. You know, Maryland does. So it's a way to see, well, okay, how much of the total state budget does each state give to the experiment station? So any state, so in Montana, it's about 0.17%. Doesn't sound like much, but any state that you see in green has a lower portion of their state budget allocated to the experiment station. Any state than Montana, any state in blue has a larger portion of their state dollars allocated to the experiment station relative to Montana. So you can see that Montana is actually, you know, we're not too bad. There's some states that are above, but we're not terrible, right? There's plenty of other states that, as a portion of their overall tax revenue, they don't support their experiment station nearly as much. So this is the good news, right? This graph shows you the good news. I guess to be an optimist about it, the opportunities are still there, because if we expand it, there's some states who give a lot more money to the experiment station. So I just, in that previous graph, I just showed you this portion And now I'm showing you the rest of it. I wanted to give you the good news first. Right, so Missouri, right, they have a lot of people, they have a lot of tax revenue, and they give about just under 1% of their total state budget goes to the experiment station. North Carolina, Georgia are right around that 0.8 to 0.9 area. So certainly opportunities to grow. So how do we work together to convince the legislatures that the stuff that we do is really important and we should get more funding because it is impactful. The other thing that was really impressive when I saw this is the leveraging of these base funds, right? So I talked about these two systems, the foundation, that's the base, that's the taxpayer dollars, and then how much additional, how are those base funds, which you can think about as seed grants, right? That's what allows you to develop the idea, and then if you want to branch out from that, or if you want to do something more with it, you go out and you get more funding from external agencies, whether it's private or other government agencies. So the blue bar represents the base funding. This is both federal and state that Mace has gotten over the past several years. And the yellow part represents the additional external grants that Mace researchers have been able to get. And I was, like I said, really impressed by the fact that basically it's a one-to-one return, right? The base, the seed grant is being doubled with the additional external grants that are being brought in by the researchers.
Is that across all fields?
That's across all of the Maze, researchers.
Anton, what percent of the maize goes to salaries?
Yeah, that's a great question. So about 76% of Maze funding goes to people, right? To pay salaries plus benefits. Another 10% goes to operations, and then there's another 15% that is everything else. But yeah, that's a great point. That most of that budget goes to salaries. It's not tractors, it's not buildings, it's brains and people.
Yeah, in the yellow bar, how are interdisciplinary grants being allocated within Maze versus to? Is it by PI? Is it by the?
That's a good question. So I'm not sure how to answer that because this comes from OSB, and this says, well, this is how we allocated this money to COA Maze. I do know that there are situations where some money may not be picked up where it really is going to ag or natural resource or environmental research, but it's coming in from some other center that's located in like the engineering school, for example. I don't know how to break that up.
There's subcontracts. I think it's reflected that way, but if there is no subcontract, then credit's not.
Yeah, because I think I don't know exactly how it's allocated, but I do know that if like a grant goes to a center, then if you're part of the center but you may be in Maze, I don't know whether that gets counted toward Maze or if it's the center that's located in some other college. But yeah, good question. So you can see that that there is quite a bit of return on this grant investment. And okay, so this is where I squint and pretend that there's causation. I'm not even going to pretend there's causation. This is just an interesting thing that I noticed from the data that is probably the best I can say is association. When the base funds increase, so do the external funds, right? So I think there's at least some opportunity to make the argument that there's complementarity, that there's not a trade-off, that there's not substitution. So making the argument, well, if we just increase your base funding, you're gonna not write as many grants because you have the money. And it doesn't appear to be a small sample associations, but at least it doesn't appear to be the case. It looks like it's complementarity. So the more resources that are given from the blue part, the more researchers go out and get those external grants, which is I think as it should be, but at least that there's some data to support some association of those two things. Okay, so I talk about research that's making a difference. This is where part of why I really enjoy doing this is I get to brag about all the cool stuff that goes on here to everyone else. So I feel like I get the compliments paid on everyone's behalf for talking about the really great research. But what I wanted to do, there's not a lot, there's a little bit of a literature out there. It's not huge, but there's some that looks at returns on investment in public R&D, agricultural R&D. And so I looked at some more recent papers from 2009 to 2012. The other problem with a lot of this literature, it doesn't break things up by state. And it also may not even break things up by region. And the more recent literature really focuses on like developing countries, not. But I was able to find a few more recent papers, and I think they tell the story pretty well of the impact of this investment in ag R&D. So on the left here, one paper that showed the annual rate of return on this ag R&D by state, and these guys broke out by state. And what you can see is the U.S., the annual rate of return is about 15.5%, and Montana is above that. And boy, if there was some sort of way, some stock that represented investment in Montana ag, it would be you get twice the return on the 90-year average of the S&P 500. So we got to think of how to monetize this a little bit. So we're outpacing the returns to that investment across the United States. The second graph, it's regions, and that Northern Great Plains regions includes Montana, the two Dakotas, and Minnesota. What that shows is they looked at a 50-year span. So what is the impact of investing $1 over a 50-year horizon, right? So this includes, okay, this brand new idea, it's developed, it's tested, it's applied, it's put out there, there's adoption of it, there's innovation, et cetera, et cetera. So over this long-term horizon, what is the benefit to cost ratio of that investment? And in the Northern Great Plains, and the way that they looked at it is they broke it up into what is the benefit to the state itself. So, what is the benefit to this region from the research that comes out of this region, plus what's the spillover effect into these, into other states across the United States. So what they find is that in the Northern Great Plains, about $42 over this 50-year horizon, that's the benefit to $1 investment in ag research, and then an additional spillover effect of $12. And that is about twice the return that we see across the other 48 states. And it was interesting in the paper, Julian, who's the author, also notes that, boy, these seem like really large numbers. And then he says, well, here's a whole bunch of other papers that show very similar numbers if you look at it along the horizon. Right? So this is where the idea of big risk, big reward, and the need and the idea of public funding these experiment stations, that the reward is quite large. So why is it larger in the Northern Great Plains? One of the arguments that both this paper and other papers that I've read on this topic make is that the type of agriculture and the type of industry here is more focused on the quality than the quantity, right? We can't grow as many bushels as Iowa. We can't grow as many cattle as, say, Texas. But focusing on the quality is important. And the fact that maybe the land isn't as good, the climate isn't as good, and so if there are improvements that are made in developing a better product, then the return on that investment is larger on the marginal end. So those are the arguments of why that return in the Northern Great Plains is higher than in other states. And I put together, this is, all right, this, again, a tiny sample of where I think of some examples of where this quality argument comes in, and specific examples of how research across faculty in the experiment station here are benefiting this idea of quality products that are being developed, or higher quality. And again, my research background is more in the production and marketing side of things. It's not in the basic research. It's not in the environmental or the natural resource field. So these examples are closer to what I know, and they were closer to the they were on the top of my head. I'm sure I'm missing a lot, but this is just a tiny sample. So last year we did a survey of looking at planting decisions and of wheat and barley in Montana. For winter wheat, almost 2/3, two in every 3 seeds almost that are being planted in Montana are those that were developed by maize researchers, right? That's incredible, right? Spring wheat, it's about 1 in 3 seeds that are being planted, and similar in barley. So, farmers are looking to what's being developed here. In the animal genetics and breeding programs, these are really important to a really important industry in Montana. Montana is the largest seed stock supplier in the U.S. I looked at some data from 2018 from the NCBA, and 1 in 6 Angus bulls that were sold came from Montana, right? So this aspect of the animal science research is really, really important for producing high quality animals that others see the value in. In terms of wool, Montana has the second highest wool value in the United States. So again, it's drawing on that research and drawing on those. The buzzword that I've been hearing this year from a lot of processors, especially in like the Midwest and Central Plains that I talked to, is crop-based proteins. That's the next big push. I mean, these processors are changing up the configuration of their processing facilities to handle plants that are higher in proteins and purchase more things like lentils and peas for domestic consumption, because that's where they see the millennial generation going and purchasing those kind of foods. And obviously, the development of the pulse industry in Montana, the largest in the US, it took 20 years of research and efforts and communication from MSU and maize to make that happen. And I don't think it played a really large role in developing that industry. And last year was the release of the first pea variety specifically for Montana production from Kevin McPhee's lab. Okay, I have a couple of slides left, and that's it. So where to now? I had to think about this a lot. I don't know, the vision, it's like the hardest thing in the world. So instead what I did is I copped out a little bit, and I put 2 slides of what I think we could be doing, or some of the questions that I think might be important for all of us to think about, and tell me how I can better facilitate this. First of all, it's the do no harm, right? I think that the stuff that has been going on for the past 100 years has been really, really good. And I think it is really, really good. And there's a lot of great researchers, there are a lot of excellent ideas, and obviously there's a lot of success that's come out of the research from maize. I think there's a lot of energy, a lot of vitality. We're unique. We're in this unique space in the United States. Obviously challenges that come along with it, but 26% of maize faculty are assistant professors. Another 30 are associate. That's a lot of young energy, and a lot of researchers who are starting out and want to get their programs developed and are bringing in this new knowledge and new information. And, you know, there's a whole bunch of really well-established connections in the more senior faculty. So I think there's a lot of this opportunity to leverage this high energy and make something really good. Also, something that I saw or that I've been noticing is this increased integration across Maze researchers and the research centers and the stakeholders. And I think on the next slide, I'll show you why I think that that's really important for this to keep going. Here's the, I'm almost certain that others have asked this. I'm not like inventing the wheel. I'm not even reinventing the wheel with these questions. I think these are ongoing, and I wish there was like an easy button that we could just solve these questions. But so this is my attempt at where do we go forward? One of the things that we do really well at Montana is do more with less. We're really, really efficient. We've been doing that for a long time. And I think my big question is, how do we go from doing more with less to doing more with more, right? So how do we get more funds for graduate students? How do we get more better facilities? How do we allocate resources to do more with more? You know, doing more with less, it's a great saying, but if we already would have been doing more with less. There's a lot of smart people here. So how do we get to from doing more with less to doing more with more, and how does the dean's office help facilitate that? How do we get, and part of that is, how do we get stakeholders to be as excited about Maze research as I am? Because I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm pretty excited about it. You know, so how do I sell this, right? How do I've been reading a bunch of Hatch project reports and Hatch project proposals over the past semester and a half. And there's like an incredible amount of great research going on. And every time I read one, I'm like, man, these people are so much better than I am. So how do I get others excited about that? Because I think that's going to bring, it's going to bring this, right? So it's going to move Montana on that graph from being down here in this corner to maybe hopefully higher on that chart that I showed you. And I think part of it is just showing up, right? Is just showing up and having a Maze face represent everyone here in this room. So, you know, that's another question I have. And the other thing is, you know, like I've been saying, 120 Maze faculty around. If I ask you what your vision is, I'm going to get at least 120 different answers. So how do we make all this work together? It's a good question. So I'll end with that. I think there's about 10 questions and 10 minutes. So any thoughts, ideas?
So you come from North Carolina, and North Carolina was up there in the top. So a lot of parallels here. How are we going to get to that North Carolina status? And I don't know what else you make in comparison, but having spent some time in North Carolina, it's amazing how many stations they have. It's amazing what comes out of all those. Maybe even Luther came from there. So give it a, maybe you don't even want to ask the question, it's off track.
Yeah, no, you know, the good news is that I did come, I lived in North Carolina, but the bad news is that I was a grad student there. So I was insulated from the ins and outs. But I think that's a great idea. I mean, part of it is looking to others who have had success and potentially looking at what we can do differently. I know that one of the things with stakeholders, I think a big challenge and potentially an opportunity is there's a lot of in-migration to Montana. And a lot of folks who are migrating into Montana are not from ag backgrounds. And a lot of those folks are going to change the demographics and they're going to change potentially what the makeup of the legislature looks like, right? So the legislature has been really helpful to ag. in terms of funding agricultural research. I don't know. Things might change in the future. So how can we get those new stakeholders as excited about production ag or environmental quality or natural resources as more traditional, right? So how do we talk about more of the food production rather than agricultural production? I think that's a challenge and also an opportunity. So, you know, I think that demographic shift that we're seeing and that we're in the midst of is not insubstantial.
I want to ask the same question, but that was a really fascinating slide. I'm curious, what do you think Georgia, Florida, North Carolina have in common besides being south? What Carolina, Missouri, Georgia, Florida, Arizona? Why? What is $200 million worth of ag? That's fascinating.
I don't know. That's a really good question. I don't know. Next time I see Greg Perry, I'll tell. Yeah. No, I mean, this has to be. So part of it could be federal because the federal funds are allocated based on the formula, which involves, you know, rural populations and a bunch of other stuff. And that formula was developed a long time ago, and I'm not sure whether or when it has changed. But it's a good question. Yeah, one thing that Greg, who presented these data initially talked about is there is a substantial bump from in states where the legislature is more Republican than Democrat. And that has benefited Montana, and except for maybe Maryland, all the other states that are over here have more Republican legislatures.
You know, when I saw that first version of that, Maryland jumped out.
Yeah.
This very local watershed issue. At least a lot of
And
money,
their proximity to Washington, D.C. might also play some role. I don't know.
Does tax revenue enter into this at all? Who are the wealthier states?
Yeah, so you know, so certainly like Missouri and, you know, Florida and others are going to be more wealthy states, and that's the idea of putting this horizontal line so that, you know, what percentage of the total money goes to the ag experience station, and so even like North Carolina has, right, that they're, you know, $470 million that they're putting toward their experiment station. But it's, you know, lower in percentage terms than Missouri relative to the overall state budget.
Right, but why is Texas, is, as you said, a Republican state, has a pretty good tax base? That seems interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. Dave. Jamie.
I have a question, given that I'm not in the College of Ag, and I did my master's at Utah State University Sociology Department, where they have a strong rural sociology tradition and strong environmental sociology tradition. And as a grad student, I was supported through my mentors there, sociologists, were supported through Mays. And I was on a project interviewing farmers about pest management practices for water conservation. So I'm curious if you hear any conversation about, or what the challenges are to opening up Mays opportunities to folks who focus on ag and natural resources.
Yeah. So the College of Ag doesn't have as much to do with it. It's more about the appointment. So it's folks who are appointed to have a Mays appointment, an experiment station appointment. And yes, most of them are in the College of Agriculture. So I don't know the answer to that. That's a good question that I could do a little bit of more digging around on.
Anton, I think that at least in some USDA grants and also an extension, so like Paula Chaparral is in
political science, right?
Is in rural development,
right?
And then USDA grants at times that they ask for things related to rural real help. Then that money pulls those people in from outside.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. But in terms of allocating those maize-based dollars, it really depends on that initial appointment or reappointment if that happens. Or Dave.
How much of the North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida money is tobacco royalties that are going back into the state? The endowments and trusts that they put aside to offset costs. Relative to ours is a big chunk of our money. We don't grow any of it. We're making cigarettes.
You're right. My best answer is I'm going to invite Greg Perry up here to do a talk on his paper instead of me trying to mangle his paper. But yeah, those are all great questions. I don't know. I don't know.
I was just, you can maybe clarify, I think, an answer to this question. Proportion of the budget that goes to salaries in ways that are kind of unseen to the average person with them. Versus the discretionary funding. Those are the people who write those reports. Discretionary amounts fairly modest.
It is. So if you think about, 76 goes to salaries, another 10% goes to operations, about 5% goes to the university for paying for things like lights and electricity and everything else that maize researchers use, but it's part of the main campus. So when you split all those things out, there's not a lot of discretionary funds left. You're right. Yeah.
We have one question online.
Sure.
Good thing for that. So this is from Jeffrey. Let's see if I can. How integrated are the lab locations into the Montana-based investment funds that can drive research to produce and share some of the costs involved, bring up money for maize and peer research? Yes, is that even feasible?
Okay, so I'm going to try to interpret that and maybe give an answer that may or may not answer the actual question. So I think is the idea that there are these contract opportunities for doing like.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Hey, sorry. So it's easier to explain.
Yeah.
I'm just looking for how integrated the research labs are into private sector investors, whether it's angel funds, VCs, Montana-based, private investors, businesses, who can help take research to product stage and implementation, or is it just publications and announcements that then you guys wait on for the private sector to pick up on and take to market?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of heterogeneity. There's a lot of variability across researchers, across labs, across it's more individual based. I know that that's something that we probably have to do more of, is find out how to leverage industry supports. I know that our new dean, Shrikala Bajwa, is looking into potentially doing that and developing a precision agriculture program that's more formal than the group that has been working on that over the past couple of years. And so there's been a lot of success in leveraging those industry funds in other universities and other places for precision ag. So there's certainly potentially opportunities here to do something similar. I think there's a lot of variability and it's hard to give you a broad answer to say that, yes, we're doing it, no, we're doing it. I think the answer is yes, but a lot of it depends on the research and the researcher.
Got it. Thanks.
Cop-out answer.
All right. Well, thanks very much.
Okay. Thanks, guys.